I didn't think twice when my friend Daniel asked for help. We'd known each other for years, long enough that favors passed between us without formalities. He worked late shifts at the hospital, and his son, Ethan, needed someone to pick him up from school a few days a week and make sure he didn't spend every evening alone. Just until things calmed down, Daniel said, his voice tired but hopeful. I agreed without hesitation, believing it was nothing more than a small kindness, the kind friends owe each other. The first afternoon I met Ethan properly, rain was falling in thin gray lines, blurring the school building into a dull silhouette. He walked toward my car slowly, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes fixed on the ground. He looked older than his age in some ways, tall, broad-shouldered, but there was something fragile in his posture, as if he were trying to take up as little space as possible. When he opened the door, he nodded politely and said hello, his voice barely louder than the rain tapping the roof. The drive home was quiet. I tried small talk, asked about school, his favorite subjects, whether he liked sports. His answers were short but respectful. He wasn't rude or distant, just careful. I assumed he was shy, maybe uncomfortable being stuck with someone who wasn't family. I remembered being his age, how awkward it felt to be watched over, even by someone well-meaning. At the house, I made him a sandwich and told him to do his homework at the kitchen table. He obeyed without complaint. While he worked, I noticed how intensely he focused, brow furrowed, pencil gripped too tightly. Every few minutes, he glanced up at me as if checking whether he was doing something wrong. I smiled, told him he was fine, and went back to scrolling through my phone. That was the rhythm at first: pickups, quiet rides, homework, dinner, ordinary, predictable. I told myself I was simply filling a gap, a temporary stand-in until Daniel's schedule improved. I didn't ask many questions, and Ethan didn't volunteer answers. It felt easier that way, but even in those early days, there were small things that lingered in my mind after I left. How Ethan always waited for permission before speaking. How he flinched slightly when a door closed too loudly. How he thanked me for everything, rides, food, even silence, as if kindness were something rare and fragile. One evening, as I was leaving, I heard him say softly, almost to himself, "See you tomorrow." I paused, surprised by how much that simple question mattered. At the time, I still believed I was just helping a friend, just showing up. I had no idea that this simple favor, these quiet afternoons and careful conversations, were already setting something much bigger in motion. By the third week, the routine no longer felt temporary. Ethan's presence had woven itself into my afternoons so naturally that I began measuring time by it: school pickup, homework hour, dinner before Daniel came home late and exhausted. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. Ethan followed rules, finished his chores, and never complained. Yet the more time I spent with him, the more I sensed that his silence wasn't calm, it was controlled. The first sign was school. One afternoon, a folded paper slipped out of Ethan's backpack as he set it down. I picked it up without thinking, assuming it was homework. It was a progress notice. Several subjects were marked with comments like incomplete assignments and lack of participation. I glanced at Ethan, expecting embarrassment or defensiveness. Instead, he looked resigned, as if he had already accepted some quiet verdict about himself. "I can help if you want," I said gently. He nodded, but his shoulders tensed. "I know the work," he replied. "I just mess up sometimes." That answer stayed with me. Kids who don't care don't talk like that. As days passed, other details began to stand out. Ethan often stared at his homework for long stretches before writing a single word. He jumped when his phone buzzed, then quickly silenced it without checking. When I asked about friends, he shrugged and said, "They're busy." Always plural, never specific, always vague. I tried not to pry. I told myself it wasn't my place. Still, I made small changes, sat at the table while he worked, asked him to explain problems out loud, praised effort instead of results. Slowly, he started talking more, not about anything important at first, just little observations about teachers or random facts he'd learned online. But even in these moments, his eyes flicked toward me constantly, as if measuring whether he was saying too much. One evening, Daniel called to say he'd be late again. When I told Ethan, his face didn't show disappointment, only relief. That reaction unsettled me more than sadness would have. It made me wonder how often he felt alone even when someone was supposed to be there. Later that night, as we cleaned up dinner, a loud laugh burst from the television in the other room. Ethan froze. A plate slipped from his hands and shattered on the floor. He stared at it, breathing fast, eyes wide with panic. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I'll clean it, I didn't mean." "It's okay," I interrupted, kneeling beside him. "It's just a plate." He nodded, but his hands were shaking. That was the moment I stopped pretending everything was fine. I began to understand that Ethan wasn't quiet by nature, he was careful. He wasn't struggling because he lacked ability, but because he carried something heavy, something unnamed, pressing down on him every day. I didn't know what it was yet. I only knew that ignoring it felt wrong. I had agreed to help my friend's son with logistics, rides, meals, supervision. Somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I had started paying attention. And attention, I was learning, can change everything. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with drama or warning. It came quietly, on an ordinary evening that should have passed like all the others. Ethan and I were sitting at the kitchen table, books spread out between us. He had been unusually tense all afternoon, tapping his pencil, rereading the same sentence over and over. Outside, the sky darkened early, clouds heavy with the promise of rain. When I asked him if he wanted a break, he shook his head too quickly. "I just need to finish," he said. Minutes passed. Then his pencil slipped from his fingers and rolled across the table. Ethan stared at it, unmoving. His breathing grew shallow, chest rising and falling too fast. At first, I thought he was frustrated, maybe overwhelmed by homework. I started to speak, to offer help, but then his hands curled into fists and his eyes filled with tears. "I can't," he whispered. The words barely reached me, but the weight behind them stopped me cold. Before I could respond, Ethan stood up abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. He backed away as if the sound itself had struck him. His face had gone pale, and his breaths came in sharp, uneven bursts. "I'm sorry," he said again, the way he always did. "I'm messing everything up, I always do." "Ethan," I said calmly, standing but keeping my distance, "you're not in trouble, look at me, you're safe." He shook his head, tears spilling freely now. "I try so hard," he choked out, "but it's never enough. I forget things, I get scared, and then everyone thinks I don't care." That was when I realized this wasn't about homework at all. I guided him to sit back down, lowering myself into the chair across from him so we were at the same level. I didn't rush him. I didn't tell him to calm down. I just stayed there, steady and quiet, until his breathing slowly began to ease. In the fragile silence that followed, Ethan spoke, not all at once, but in pieces. He talked about feeling invisible at school, about teachers who misunderstood him, about classmates who mocked him when he froze or stuttered under pressure. He talked about the fear that followed him everywhere, the constant sense that one wrong move would confirm what he secretly believed, that he was broken in some way. "I don't want my dad to worry," he said softly. "He already works so hard." Something shifted inside me then. I had thought I was helping by being present, by filling in when his father couldn't. But listening to Ethan, truly listening, I understood that what he needed most wasn't supervision or structure. It was permission to be honest without fear. "You're not a problem to fix," I told him, "and you're not alone, not anymore." He looked up at me, eyes red and searching, as if testing whether those words were real. In that moment, the invisible line between helper and something more disappeared. I didn't yet know what the right next steps were. I only knew that while after that night, nothing felt simple anymore. The routine stayed the same: school pickups, homework, quiet dinners, but the meaning behind it had shifted. I was no longer just watching over Ethan. I was carrying the knowledge of his fears, his self-doubt, the fragile trust he had placed in me. And with that trust came a question I couldn't ignore. What was my responsibility now? Ethan changed in subtle ways. He spoke more, asked questions, even laughed occasionally. But alongside those changes came a new dependence. He began looking to me for reassurance before making even small decisions, checking my reaction before answering a question, waiting for approval before sharing an opinion. I could see how easily support could slip into something unhealthy if I wasn't careful. At night, I replayed our conversations in my head. I wondered whether I should tell Daniel everything Ethan had shared. Part of me felt it was necessary. Daniel was his father, after all. He deserved to know what his son was going through. But another part of me remembered the fear in Ethan's eyes when he talked about disappointing him. Breaking that confidence felt like a betrayal. I found myself standing on an invisible line, one foot in care, the other in caution. One evening, Ethan asked a question that forced the issue. We were washing dishes together when he said, without looking at me, "If you tell my dad, will he be mad?" The vulnerability in his voice tightened my chest. "I think he'd be worried," I said carefully. "Not angry." Ethan nodded but didn't seem convinced. "I just don't want to make things harder." That sentence told me everything about how much pressure he carried. He wasn't afraid of punishment, he was afraid of being a burden. I realized then that my role wasn't to replace his father or to become his shield from the world. It was to help him find his own voice, strong enough to speak even when he was afraid. And that meant setting boundaries, even when it felt uncomfortable. The next afternoon, when Ethan froze during a simple math problem and looked to me for the answer, I resisted the urge to step in. Instead, I asked him to explain what he did understand. He hesitated, then slowly began talking through it. His solution wasn't perfect, but it was his. "That's it," I said. "You did that." The small smile that crossed his face was worth every second of discomfort. I also began gently preparing him for a bigger conversation, encouraging him to share pieces of his experience with his father when he felt ready. I didn't force it. I didn't rush it. I just reminded him that needing help wasn't failure. Inside, I was still afraid of making the wrong choice. There was no guidebook for this, no clear rule about where kindness ended and responsibility began. But I was learning that real support wasn't about control or secrecy. It was about honesty, patience, and knowing when to step back. Crossing that invisible line had changed me, too. I no longer saw myself as someone doing a favor. I saw myself as someone who had been trusted with something fragile, and who had to be careful enough not to break it king away. Pretending this was still just a favor was no longer an option. That unexpected moment, raw, vulnerable, and painfully human, changed us both. The real test came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, Ethan came home unusually quiet, even for him. He dropped his backpack by the door and went straight to the kitchen table without waiting for instructions. I noticed his hands trembling as he pulled out his books. When I asked how school was, he hesitated, then said, "Can we talk later?" His voice was tight, like a string pulled too far. I let him be for a while, giving him space. When we finally sat down after dinner, he took a deep breath and told me what had happened. A teacher had called on him unexpectedly to present his work in front of the class. His mind had gone blank. A few students laughed. Someone whispered something cruel. The teacher, misunderstanding his silence, had scolded him for not preparing. "I wanted to disappear," he said, staring at the table. "I keep thinking maybe they're right, maybe I just can't do this." Everything in me wanted to storm the school, demand explanations, fix it for him. Instead, I remembered what I had promised myself, to support without taking over. "That moment doesn't define you," I said, "but what you do next matters." He looked up uncertain. "What if I mess it up again?" "Then you try again," I replied. "Not because it's easy, because you're worth the effort." The next day, Ethan told me he wanted to speak to the teacher. The words sounded brave, but fear flickered behind his eyes. He asked if I could come with him. I agreed, but only as a silent presence, not a voice that would speak for him. The meeting was tense. Ethan's hands shook as he explained how anxiety made it hard for him to speak under pressure. His voice faltered, but he didn't stop. The teacher listened, surprised, then softened. She apologized for misjudging him and suggested accommodations, extra time, alternative ways to present. When we left the classroom, Ethan let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. "Did it?" he said quietly. "Yes," I answered, "you did." That evening, Daniel noticed the change. Ethan talked more than usual at dinner, sharing pieces of his day. I watched Daniel carefully, waiting for confusion or concern. Instead, there was something like pride in his eyes. Later, after Ethan went to his room, Daniel asked me, "What happened?" I told him the truth, not all at once, not every detail, but enough. About Ethan's anxiety. About the pressure he felt. About how hard he was trying. Daniel sat silently, hands clasped, the weight of realization settling over him. "I didn't know," he said finally. "Now you do," I replied gently, "and he needs you." That night, I realized trust wasn't just between Ethan and me anymore. It was expanding, fragile but necessary, binding all of us together. Ethan had taken his first real step forward on his own, and in doing so, he had taught me that belief, when shared carefully, can become courage. Right, change didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, steady steps, quiet victories that might have gone unnoticed if you weren't looking closely. Ethan didn't suddenly become fearless or outspoken. He still hesitated, still struggled on difficult days. But something essential had shifted inside him. He no longer believed he was alone. With the support of his teacher and his father, school became more manageable. Ethan learned strategies to ground himself when anxiety crept in, slowing his breathing, writing thoughts down before speaking, asking for time instead of shutting down. Each success, no matter how small, added a brick to a foundation that had once been cracked with doubt. When he stumbled, he didn't spiral the way he used to. He looked up instead, searching for reassurance, and more often than not, finding it within himself. Daniel changed too. He rearranged his schedule when he could, made space for conversations that went deeper than grades or chores. I saw him listening more carefully, asking better questions, learning how to be present in ways he hadn't realized his son needed. There were awkward moments, even painful ones, but they were honest, and honesty, I learned, heals faster than silence ever could. As for me, my role slowly shifted again. I stopped being the center of Ethan's support system and became part of it instead. I was still there, still driving him home, still sitting at the kitchen table, but I stepped back enough for him to step forward. The balance felt right, healthy, necessary. One evening, months later, I watched Ethan stand in the living room holding a note card, practicing a short presentation for school. His voice wavered at first, then steadied. When he finished, he looked at us expectantly. "How was that?" he asked. Daniel smiled. "Proud doesn't even begin to cover it." Ethan glanced at me next. I nodded. "You spoke clearly, and you didn't give up." That was the moment I realized how far he'd come, not because he was perfect, but because he believed he deserved to be heard. When it was time for me to step away, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like completion. The afternoons grew quieter, my role less essential, and that was exactly how it should be. Ethan no longer needed someone to stand between him and the world. He had learned to face it himself. Looking back, I still marvel at how it all began with something so ordinary, a simple favor, a willingness to help. I thought I was offering convenience. What I was really offering was presence. And in return, I received something I hadn't expected, a deeper understanding of how much impact quiet kindness can have. One unexpected moment had changed us both, but it was everything that followed, the listening, the patience, the trust, that truly transformed our lives. Some favors end when they're no longer needed. This one became a part of who I am.